Dungeons and Dragons wasn't always just about the heroes. In the early days, adventurers traveled with whole entourages of torchbearers, guards, and even war dogs. But these weren't NPCs run by the DM, they were actual characters under a player's control. So why did the game expect you to bring a small army into the dungeon? And why did we stop? Let's uncover the forgotten role of henchmen and hirelings today on Daddy Roll the One. Hello there, and welcome back. This is another video in my new series on rules worth remembering, which is going to look at forgotten mechanics and ideas from the history of Dungeons and Dragons that might actually be worth bringing back to your table today, regardless of what game you're playing. You could be playing an OSR style game, but even if you're playing something like 5e or Daggerheart or Shadow Dark, these are concepts that you can consider bringing back into any of those games, incorporating them into the game to kind of, change the style of play and recapture a little bit of that old school feel, regardless of system. Now, this series is also going to be part of, it's a sub-playlist of my overall series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons and Dragons. So just what I want to think about with this particular video on henchmen and hirelings and all of the associated terms that go with them, and we're going to go over that in a second, is the idea of what if your adventuring party wasn't just 3 or 4 or maybe even 5 PC characters at the table, but up to a dozen or more? And what if those extra characters could do things like betray you or desert you, or maybe even save your life at the last second? So these are all concepts that we can get from the idea of henchmen and hirelings. And, in modern D&D, sidekicks, which is I think what 5e calls, having a single type of henchman, it definitely feels optional. It's not even in the core rules. It was part of an additional rule book. I forget which one. I don't, really play 5e, as you guys know. But in old school D&D, henchmen and hirelings were baked into the rules of the game, into the mechanics and the DNA. And it was assumed from the beginning, or at least maybe expected, that you were going to be hiring these types of characters. So by the end of this particular video, you should be able to understand why these concepts existed and how they worked, and then how you can use them, like I said, in any role-playing game today. So if learning that kind of history and also learning about these sort of forgotten concepts that have fallen by the wayside over the past few decades is something that interests you and you find educational, informative, and fun, then please take a few seconds to like the video, double check to make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and make sure to adjust the settings on the bell icon so that YouTube will notify you when I upload new videos. So to start out, I want to talk about the terms that are being used. Now, one of the things that I did in preparation to make this video was I asked the folks on my Patreon account if they could share with me their ideas on what they wanted to see out of this particular video. So I let them know I was making a video about henchmen and hirelings and those concepts, and find out what were the things that they wanted me to cover. And one of the things that came up with my patrons was the idea that they wanted to hear stories from people who were there at the time and actually used henchmen and hirelings in their games. So we did use henchmen and hirelings when I was a kid. Sometimes, not every time. We didn't use them, I think, as intended. We definitely used them more as what people would now call meat shields, which is not really the right approach to take, I don't think. We'll talk about that as we go through the video. And we would tend to forget about them when it wasn't in combat or when there was something dangerous to be done. And then all of a sudden you'd remember that you'd hired this person and that maybe they should go take that dangerous task so that you didn't risk your character. And that's really not a great way to look at it. But, we were kids and we didn't have examples. But I would love to hear from you guys in the comments, people who actually did use henchmen and hirelings back in the day, and talk about your experiences with them so that I can share that with my patrons. And this is, of course, a good reminder that I did just start a Patreon account that you guys, a lot of you asked me to do that. And so I just started it last week. You can find it at patreon.com/daddyrollthe1. I'll be sharing a lot of content there, custom content that you won't find anywhere else, including short adventures. Like I just posted a 4-page adventure today. It's September 11th as I'm recording this. That's got custom artwork and maps that you won't find anywhere else because my friend did them for me, my friend and designer, Bill Green. Okay, so that's just a quick little note about my Patreon. So really quickly, I wanted to talk about some terms that we're going to be using here, because a lot of people use these terms interchangeably, including the rule books themselves. And it can start to get confusing when you're talking about these things and what are the differences between hirelings and henchmen and followers and all these different terms. So I'm going to define how I use them in my games and how I'm going to be talking about them in the course of this video. But just note that sometimes they change, and I will try to point that out, where one term is used in one edition of the rules, and then talking about that exact same concept, they'll use a completely different term. Okay, so hirelings I'm going to talk about are non-combat NPCs. So these are your people like your torchbearers, your porters, your cooks, things like that. Could be zero-level humans, but people that aren't going to participate in, like I said, non-combat, okay? And then you have henchmen. Now, sometimes henchmen are called retainers. So those are the two terms that are kind of interchangeable. So BX D&D calls them retainers. Advanced D&D calls them henchmen. And OD&D doesn't use either one of those terms. It just uses a catch-all term of hirelings to mean anybody that you hire. But henchmen are different than hirelings. And at least that's how I'm going to use them in the discussion of this. And that's how they're used in later editions of the rules. But they're typically NPC adventures. They have classes and levels, and they're people who would join you kind of long term. So a hireling you might hire for a single adventure, like a torchbearer. I need someone to carry a torch while I go dungeon delve. And you hire them. You might hire them again in the future, but a henchman is someone that you're going to hire on a long-term kind of contract basis for the most part. And these are going to be people like they're your squires. They can be, or your apprentices, or in D&D terms, they use the term, in 5e terms, they use that term sidekick, which I talked about. So this could be like a sidekick, like a lieutenant, sort of. Somebody that you trust. So think of like Batman and Robin. You could think of Robin as being like Batman's henchman. So I know in the Batman world, they use the word henchman differently, but we're using the D&D terms here. So Robin could be a PC in his own right. Absolutely. But if you think of the relationship that Batman's the main character and Robin's kind of there to back him up, he kind of fits that henchman role. But it could also be a servant. So even like Alfred could be a henchman type character. So if you've seen the new Tom Holland, like the Spider-Man movies, and the very first one was it Spider-Man Coming Home, I think it was, whatever that first one was. The character of Ned, she's like, can I be the guy in the chair? I want to be the guy in the chair. And I laughed so hard at that because, I'm a comic book nerd, and that is such a trope in comic books. Like Oracle in DC Comics is the same concept, right? So the person that stays behind but could monitor everything and give you advice on like how to do stuff. And so that is a classic henchman and ally. Sometimes it could be a family member even, but these are the types of characters, again, that are going to have much more place in the game. They're going to have much more of a role and personality and things like that. Now, you also have a couple other things that we can talk about here, which are mercenaries. So mercenaries are technically hirelings, but they're a special kind of hireling. And these are professional soldiers that you're going to hire for specific jobs, guards, caravan, escorts, soldiers. If you're doing domain play, like you're going into war, you can use them in wilderness style campaigns. We'll talk about that later as we get into the expert rules for the BX version of D&D, where to accompany you on your way to a place, and you need guards on the road or like whatever, but they're not necessarily going to go into the dungeon. It depends on which edition of the game you're talking about, of course. And then you have specialists, which are another kind of hireling, but they are there to perform a very specific task. So they are non-adventuring expert types like alchemists or sages or engineers, spies, those kinds of people. Those are all going to be specialists. So again, you kind of have like two main categories here. You have hirelings, which include zero-level non-combatants, right? You have mercenaries, which are hirelings that will fight, but only in certain circumstances. And then you have specialists who are non-combatants, but are there to perform very specific services that you need, okay? And then you've got henchmen, which are like I said, like you're almost like your second in command. It's a trusted friend and ally of your character. Okay. Now there's one more thing we want to talk about here, and that's the term followers. Okay. So followers are people that get assigned to high level characters in certain editions of D&D, and that is part of domain play. So you hit a certain level and you either attract automatically, or you can hire followers to help you, man your castle or your hideout or your tower or whatever it is that you're building, your temple, if you're a cleric. Okay, so those are followers, and they're handled a little bit differently. All right, so those are the terms that we're looking at. So let's jump in then and look at the origins of using henchmen and hirelings, or whatever you want to call them. In this particular case, that's going to make a difference because we're only going to use the term hirelings, and it's going to be a catch-all. Okay, so this is original D&D, 1974. This is Men in Magic, the first book. And where we first encountered the idea in here of henchmen and hirelings is in the description of the charisma score. And it says, charisma is a combination of appearance, personality, and so forth. Its primary function is to determine how many hirelings of unusual nature a character can attract. This is not to say that he cannot hire men at arms and employ mercenaries, but the charisma function will affect loyalty of even these men. Players will, in all probability, seek to hire fighting men, magic users, and or clerics in order to strengthen their roles in the campaign. A player character can employ only as many as indicated by his charisma score. And then it shows you a range, a score going from 3 to 18. It's usually grouped in groups of 2 numbers, sometimes 3. So it's 3 to 4, 5 to 6, 7 through 9, 10 through 12, 13 through 15, 16 to 17, and then 18. And so it tells you at a charisma score of 3 to 4, the maximum number of hirelings you can have is 1, and their loyalty base is -2. Whereas at a charisma of 18, the maximum number of hirelings you can have is 12, and their loyalty base is +4. Okay, so that's important because as you've watched these videos before, if you have watched these videos before, and for those of you who have, I apologize for doing this, but there's always new people coming into the videos. So every once in a while, I have to explain a concept that you might have already heard, and I will try to be brief. But ability scores in original D&D do very, very little, aside from helping you gain experience points quicker if it's in your prime requisite, or gaining experience points slower if your prime requisite is low. If your prime requisite is high, you add 10%. So what's a prime requisite? A fighter's prime requisite is strength. A magic user's prime requisite is intelligence. For clerics, it's wisdom. Okay, so if those scores for those particular characters are 15 or more, they add 10% to their experience. But if it's 6 or less, they're going to take -20%. Okay, so that's the only effect it's going to have. Strength has no other impact in original D&D other than to affect how a fighter advances, whether it's fast or slow. Okay, so it's not until you get into later supplements like Greyhawk where it says, oh, strength is also going to impact how well you hit and how much damage you do, but that's not an original D&D. So if you didn't play with the supplements, strength was really irrelevant in the game other than, like I said, for experience points. But you see, charisma has this whole section detailing this part about hiring people, and that's because this is a huge expectation of this game, that you're going to want to hire people. And it even says players are probably going to want to hire people. So why is that? Well, this is coming out of the wargaming roots of Dungeons and Dragons. So, both Gary and Dave were wargamers, okay? And then Dave starts to go really heavy into the role-playing aspects in Blackmoor. And Gary, until he's exposed to Blackmoor, is still firmly rooted in these war games like Chainmail, but there's others as well, right? So, and those games dealt with things like troop morale and troop movement and resource management and all that kind of stuff. And it's the blending of those two kind of concepts that gives us what is unique about Dungeons and Dragons. But this game, from the very beginning, and again, this is something we have talked about, the subtitle of the game is Rules for Fantastic Medieval War Games Campaigns, playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. So this was considered by Gary, at least, and by other people, to be a war game. And war games have certain things that you expect from them, including masses of troops moving around and doing things and holding territory and invading other people's territory and things like that. So this concept of having all these extra players around was very important, and it was just how they played back then. It was just something that you did and you wanted to have available to you. Okay, so when we look into original D&D, though, the next part that we're going to see here where it talks about them is in the section, next page, on non-player characters. And it says, in all probability, the referee will find it beneficial to allow participants in the campaign to hire into service one or more characters. At times, this may be nothing more than a band of mercenaries hired to participate. However, it says, however, it is like that players will be desirous of acquiring a regular entourage of various character types, monsters, and an army of some form. Non-player characters can be hired as well. So that's what I'm talking about. He's talking about, like, your player character is probably going to want an army to follow them around. That's going back to those war game roots. That's why this concept was around back then. Okay. Now, it's going to go on and talk about only the lowest level types of characters can be hired. The player wishing to hire a non-player character advertises by posting notices at inns and taverns, frequents public places seeking the desired hireling, or sends messengers to whatever place the desired character type would be found. And then it says elfland, dwarfland, etc. This costs money and takes time, and the referee must determine expenditures. Once some response has been obtained, the player must make an offer to tempt the desired character type into his service. As a rule of thumb, a minimum offer of 100 gold pieces would be required to tempt a human into service. Dwarves are more interested in gold, magic users and elves desire magical items, and clerics want some assurance of having a place to worship in which to house themselves. Okay, so that's how you hire, and that's the detail you're going to get on how to hire someone. Okay, now it's going to get into making the reaction to see if they're going to accept. It says monsters can be lured into service if they are of the same basic alignment as the player character, or they can be charmed and thus ordered to serve. Note, however, that the term monster includes men found in dungeons. So in this way, some high-level characters can be brought into a character's service, charisma allowing or through a charm spell. Some reward must be offered to a monster in order to induce it into service, not just sparing its life, for example. The monster will react with appropriate pluses or minuses according to the offer, the referee rolling 2d6, 2 six-sided dice, and adjusting for charisma. So this is the classic 2d6 reaction table, which is also found in the BX version of D&D. And in BECME Rule Cyclopedia. And it's one of my favorite tables, the reaction table, that you can use for so many different uses. Okay, the 2d6, so on a roll of 2, it says the person you're trying to hire is going to attempt to attack you. So that's very extreme. And then at the high end, at 12, they are enthusiastic and their loyalty is going to be +3. And that's going to be on top of whatever charisma bonus you get, assuming you get a charisma bonus. So that would be very powerful. And then it says an uncertain reaction, which would be a 6 to 8, leaves the door open to additional reward offers, but scores under 6 do not. So anything under 6 is a hostile reaction, with 2 being they attack immediately. Anything over 8 is that they accept the offer. And then again at 12, they're enthusiastically loyal. Okay, and then it goes on to say loyalty of non-player characters, including monsters. Men, dwarves, and elves will serve as retainers with relative loyalty so long as they receive their pay regularly, are treated fairly, and are not continually exposed to extra hazardous duty, and receive bonuses when they are taking part in some dangerous venture. Judgment of this matter is perforce subjective on the part of the campaign referee, but there is a simple guideline. When one or more of such characters are taken into service, a loyalty check is made by rolling 3 six-sided dice. Adjustments are made for charisma and initial payments for service, and the loyalty of the characters noted by the referee. The player will not have any knowledge of what it is without some method of reading minds. So the DM's going to roll this loyalty score for each of the people that the character's hiring, and then keep that secret. Okay, so a loyalty score of 3 or less what means that they're going to desert at the first opportunity. And a loyalty score of 19 and above, which you can get by rolling 3d6 and then having a charisma bonus, it's assuming you rolled really high, obviously, says that they never need to check morale. So they're just going to serve regardless. And then everything in between is somewhere along that scale. So sometimes it means they get pluses on their morale dice. Lower scores mean they get negatives to their morale dice. And then a medium score of 9 to 12 means they're just average. They don't get a bonus or a penalty. Okay. And then it says non-player characters and men-at-arms will have to make morale checks using the above reaction table or chainmail. So they're telling you can use that other game, chainmail, which it tells you at the beginning of this book you should have to play this game. Whenever a highly dangerous or unnerving situation arises, poor morale will mean that those in question will not perform as expected. Periodic rechecks of loyalty should be made. Length of service, rewards, etc. will bring additional pluses. Poor treatment will bring minuses. So that's going to be the extent of what we see here about hirelings in original D&D. It's all right there, and it's mostly in the hands of the referee to figure out how that's going to work. So just again, as a quick note for people who are new to learning about old school Dungeons and Dragons, referee is what we would now call a dungeon master. The term dungeon master didn't exist when this was written. Okay. So if you're also new to old school D&D and you're playing a game like Old School Essentials, that was your entry. That's the reason that they use the term referee. One, because dungeon master is trademarked by Wizards of the Coast, but two, it's because referee goes all the way back to the original game here. So that's going to be it for that kind of hireling, like these people that you pay. So the mechanical depth really in old school D&D about hirelings, it's really mostly about the loyalty score, that, morale, and then those reaction rolls. And there's very little else in here mechanically about how to run these types of characters. But in the early games of Dungeons and Dragons, again, coming from that wargaming background, especially Gygax, his players use these types of characters all the time. Okay. So, in like his Greyhawk games, we've talked about this before on the channel, but there were like dozens or actually scores of people that played in these Greyhawk games, but they didn't all play at the same time. So they were broken up into individual groups of party members that played together. So there was party A and party B. They didn't call them that, but I'm just using those terms. But there could be party C, D, E, etc. Right? And so party A would go into the dungeon, okay, and they needed help because they only had 5 or 6 players at the time. And so they would hire extra people to help them accomplish the tasks that needed to be accomplished. Okay, so one of the things and the reasons why you wanted these types of characters with you is because in original D&D, and this is the case for most of the versions of TSR D&D, so not the Wizards of the Coast version, but the vast majority of experience points that you're going to earn during the game is going to come from treasure, specifically like gold. So you're going to convert everything into its gold piece equivalent, so silver, copper, etc. And experience points was on a 1-for-1 basis with gold. Okay, so you find all this gold. Well, it's heavy. So, and you don't get the experience points for finding it. You get the experience points for taking it out of the dungeon. And some DMs said you didn't even get the experience points for taking it. You got the experience points when you spent the gold in the town. And so they would create situations for you to spend all this gold on things. And so you have to carry chests of gold around. Well, as a player character, you can't carry all that gold. It's too much. So you hired people, porters, right, to carry these chests of gold. Those are your 0 level, like non-combatant humans. You hired people to carry torches because it's dark and you can't see. Darkness was a huge factor in these early games that basically gets ignored in modern D&D. Darkness is not a scary thing any longer because almost every character has dark vision. And for the ones that don't, a lot of the modern modules tell you that the dungeon's just naturally lighted and you don't need torches and stuff to see because modern players don't like to track things like that. I love having darkness as a factor in the games like that I run for my daughter and her friends. So they're constantly buying and counting the number of torches. But if you're holding a torch in one hand and a shield in the other, then you're going to be in trouble when you get into combat because you've got to drop this torch, which is probably going to go out when you drop it, and then draw your weapon and all that kind of stuff. Or you could hire somebody to carry the torch for you and to have extras available so that when one runs out, you've got another one ready to go, right? So that's kind of how they used these kinds of things in these early games. It was to help them explore and dungeon delve and carry things. And also sometimes you would send them in ahead. Like if you thought a room was trapped, you might offer one of your hirelings an extra share of whatever treasure it is or pay them more or whatever if they went forward and saw if there was a trap there. And then if it got triggered, then you saved your player character. Now that's probably going to have repercussions later when you're trying to hire again. And people are like, yeah, aren't you the guy that sent the person in that like they died in the dungeon because you made them, trip the trap? Right. But that was part of these early style of games and the way that people played. Very, very different from the way that a lot of people play today. So one of the things that I really like that it talks about in original D&D was that section where it said, oh, well, you can go to inns and taverns and you can hang up posters or you can advertise to try to find people. Well, I did it like that in my game, but a little bit in reverse. So if you've seen my DM prep videos before, my DM advice, I use something like this. Which is like it's the job board, it's the tavern board. So every tavern has one of these. And when the player characters go to a new tavern, I change the signs up. Okay, so I got this idea from Professor Dungeon Master at Dungeon Craft, and he got it from, I think it's Little Keep on the Borderlands, which is part of the Hackmaster game. But I had people leaving notices that they were looking for work. So my player characters show up, and then they could read immediately and see who's looking for work, and then ask around, say, where can I find this person? And then from there, that's how they kind of started to start the process of interviewing people. And it gives them also a little bit of personality. So I put this board up, and so you see this guy says, a lot of these start to sound repetitive, and it's because I got lazy, but this guy says, need work, will carry almost anything, good with sword, and I deliberately spelled sword incorrectly so that my player characters knew, like, he's probably not that smart, right? And then it says, ask for Radix the Red at the Greased Goat. And then this one down here, where is it? So, father of four needs work. And it says, strong back, can carry torches, chests, feed animals, and do as told. Ask for Rattler at the Greased Goat. Now, just a quick thing. If I had to do this over again, I would change one of these names because Radix and Rattler, the player characters or the players, and I both started to get confused about who was who because their names were so similar. That was just bad planning on my part. But these were two different guys. But you can see this guy says he's a father of four and needs work. So already you've got an idea that, like, this guy's adventuring into dangerous areas because he's trying to take care of his kids. And one of the things that happened was they interviewed this guy and he accepted the job offer, but he made them sign a contract that if he died, they weren't going to take his treasure, that they were going to give his share of the treasure to his kids, so that he could take care of them even after he died. And that really made a connection with my players. And also they went out of their way to make sure that this guy didn't die during an adventure because they wanted to make sure that he was able to take care of his kids. They felt bad, right? So they had empathy for this guy, and it was really cool. This guy, they just felt bad that he seemed like he was very down on his luck and not very bright. And so they kind of treated him like a little kid, almost like a kind of like a little buddy. It was kind of cute. But then you've got other ones here. So this one says, mother seeks work, can cook, clean, carry torches, and am handy with a spear. Ask for Aldith at the Wicker Ram. So again, what is she good at doing? And it's given right away, like, oh, she could be the camp cook when we're camping out. She can cook things or find, she's probably good at foraging or like whatever, right? And then this one says, will work, will carry almost anything, strong back at arms, and then ask for Cole the Red. So that's another mistake on my part because I already had a guy named Radix the Red, and then I called this guy Cole the Red. I shouldn't have done that. But the characters use these all the time. And they found it was a great way for them to, like, make connections immediately with these NPCs. And then they would ask at the tavern, like, hey, where's Radix? Is he here? What does he look like? And then they would go up and talk to him, and he'd be like, oh, you saw my job notice. Like, great. Well, tell me what you're doing. And they would talk to him like that. And that's how they got to know who was looking for work, as opposed to them hanging notices for that. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute as to why I did it that way. But just as a quick note on this board, I just think it's funny. So there was a notice here and it said seeking the executioner. So that's a rival NPC party. And so somebody put, it says job opportunity applied at the guild house. And so my characters saw that while they were looking for people to hire. And so they went to the guild house and tried to get the drop on the executioners and said, we'll do the job for like half or like whatever it was. Right. So, they were trying to be very clever, but using a board like that is a really good way to kind of help you, kind of make your games a little bit more fun and things like that. Okay. So that is going to be the look at original D&D and how some of these concepts originally came about and why they were in the game. Like, it's that wargaming roots, this idea that, even like in Chainmail, you could have individual heroes in the fantasy supplement, but mostly you're going to be controlling an army. You're going to have your hero, but you're going to have all these other people under them. And so it's kind of related to that, right? This concept of having these masses of people that are all exploring. And it does make sense the way the dungeons were designed back then. So there was an expectation that there was going to be attrition. You were going to lose characters, whether they were NPCs that you hired or whether they were PCs. And then if your PC dies, you've got an NPC henchman right there that can step up and become a player character so that you don't have to wait until, you round the corner and there's a guy wanting to join your party. You don't have to do that. you've already got somebody there that's got a built-in personality that you've hired. Okay, so that is kind of how it's handled in original D&D. Now, the supplements don't deal with it too much. The one that they do add is in Blackmore. There's a little bit of a discussion on adding a sage NPC. That's where it first debuts. And if that is something that is interesting to you, you'll probably want to watch my video on like the forgotten classes of early D&D. And very specifically, I talk about the merchant and sage, which are two roles or archetypes that Dave Arneson used in his games that didn't ever really make it into mainstream Dungeons and Dragons. But when he wrote the manuscript, the original draft of the Blackmore supplement that was heavily edited by Tim Kask. And it depends on which version you believe, whether Tim just didn't like it and rewrote it, or whether Dave didn't turn in much of a manuscript and Tim was forced to add. There are two different sides to that story, and it's been 50 years, and I don't think we're ever going to know the true side because Dave Arneson unfortunately passed away. Maybe one day his original manuscript will surface, but until that happens, we just have to go on what people say. But in any event, there is a sage in the back of that book, and it is presented as a non-player character specialist that you could hire. And a lot of people believe that originally that was introduced by Dave Arneson in his original manuscript as a player character class, and that Tim Kask didn't like it because either he didn't like the idea of a sage adventuring into a dungeon because he thought it didn't make sense, or because he and Dave Arneson just really didn't get along. And so Tim decided to change it just for the sake of changing it. So I would hope that that's not the case, but in whatever case, it's presented in there as a non-player character. And I talk more about that in that video on those forgotten character classes from early D&D. Should also mention that that video I mentioned at the beginning, the forgotten rules that actually made the forgotten D&D rules that actually make your game better. So I did touch on Henchmen and Hirelings in that very briefly, like toward the end. So this is expanding on that and blowing the concept up into a full deep dive. But that video also discusses the idea of morale and how to use morale in a game. So if you want more details on that, you can check out that video. It's been one of my most popular. I think the channel's been around now for 2.5 years, a little bit more than that. And I made that video about 3 months ago, and it's already like the third most popular video on the channel. So definitely want to check that out. Now, one of the things that I wanted to talk about here was the idea of followers and domain level play. So it says for fighting men that top level fighters, lords and above, lords being the level title for a 9th level fighter, who build castles are considered barons, and as such, they may invest in their holdings in order to increase their income. So it doesn't say anything about followers there, but you're going to build a castle. You have to have people that live there. And so probably you're going to hire people, right? So that is the discussion of like hirelings for them. Magic users, it doesn't really get into it at all in original D&D. Okay. But where we really find this is in clerics. So it says, when clerics reach the top level, which is patriarch in original D&D, which I believe is 8th level, but that's where they topped out in original D&D. I just talked about this in another video. Just double check that. Yes, so you see here, patriarch is an 8th level cleric level title, and that's where they topped out. So clerics of patriarch level may opt to build their own stronghold, and when doing so, they receive help from above. Thus, if they spend 100,000 gold pieces in castle construction, they may build a fortress at double that cost. Finally, faithful men will come to such a castle, being fanatically loyal, and they will serve at no cost. There will be from 10 to 60 heavy cavalry, 10 to 60 horse crossbowmen, and 30 to 180 heavy foot. So those just show up. All right, so that's just something that's going to happen. So those are kind of like followers. So those aren't people, like, you have to pay upkeep for them, but you don't pay them for their service. It says they're fanatically loyal. They're just going to show up and serve you. And this is a concept that we're going to see in future versions of D&D going forward, and it's going to expand beyond the cleric. But let's continue and look at basic D&D. So I am not going to do every edition of D&D here. I'm going to do original. I'm going to do BX or basic expert or Moldvay Cookmarsh, however you want to refer to this, from 1981. I am going to look at advanced D&D from 1977 through 79, first edition, And then I am going to very, very briefly at the end talk about how things change with like second edition advanced. And then during the WotC editions, I'm going to kind of lump all them together. But specifically, I'm going to talk about third edition only to show how it's so different from original D&D. All right. But I'm not going to go into Holmes and BECME and Rule Cyclopedia and all that kind of stuff. Okay. So in BX and BECME, we're going to see clearer rules in here for retainers, loyalty, morale, pay, all that kind of stuff. So you saw how open-ended it was in original D&D. We're going to see much more clarity in BX, and that's just a virtue of how much time has passed and how much time there has been to capture people's questions about how to use these concepts and then figure out how to apply them and like write rules for them. Okay. So that's what most of these future editions are doing. Okay. And it's also going to get into specialists much more so. I mean, the only specialist that we really see in Blackmore is that Sage, that the Blackmore supplement for original D&D is that Sage. And then it's also, there's going to be a little bit of a transition to talk about followers at high level. So let's just get into it and look at what we're talking about here. So the section on these types of characters is going to be on page B21. Okay. And it's going to call them retainers. So see, this is what I'm talking about, where the terms aren't always consistent. And it says a retainer, and then it says in parentheses, or hireling, is a person hired by a player character or PC to aid that character on an adventure. The number of retainers who will follow a PC is limited by that character's charisma score. If a retainer is not well treated, he or she is likely to stop working for the PC and will tell others of the mistreatment. Retainers are more than just men-at-arms, soldiers hired to fight and protect their employer, but only expected to take reasonable risks. Retainers are lieutenants or assistants to a PC and are expected to lend their skills and knowledge to the benefit of the party and to take the same risks the characters expect to face. Okay, so that's retainers, but it says or hirelings. So it sounds like, well, what's the difference here? And it's going to eventually tell us over here in the section on using retainers. And it says retainers are often used to strengthen a party which is attempting an extremely dangerous adventure. It is recommended that the DM not allow beginning players to hire retainers. I'll talk about that in a second. New players tend to use retainers as a crutch, letting them take all risks. If a dungeon is very difficult, the DM should let players have more than one character apiece before using retainers, at least until players are more experienced. Hirelings are experts which can be hired by the characters. They are more suited to higher level campaigns and are explained in the D&D expert set. So this is going to try to distinguish between retainers and hirelings, but it doesn't really give you much more detail on hirelings because that's going to be in a different book. But the way that retainers are explained in this book is the same way that henchmen are going to be explained in advanced D&D. So that's why I say the two terms are interchangeable and they're different from your standard everyday hireling. Okay, so really quick, where it says that you shouldn't allow beginning characters to hire. Mine did. In the game that I run for my daughter and her friends, they were hiring people at first level. And within like 3-4 sessions of starting, they figured out that they needed help. They made their way to the tavern at the Keeper in the Borderlands, and they immediately began looking for people to hire that into their service. And I did that because, I figured that they could just handle it. And I was like, why not? And for me, it's part of the game. I wanted to see how they handled running these extra characters and how they treated them and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's the description on retainers. And then it's going to say to hire a retainer, a character must first find NPCs who are interested in the job. Characters will have to go somewhere they might find and interview interested NPCs, such as a tavern, or they must pay a fee to advertise for NPCs to come and see them. The DM must create the personalities of the NPCs who come to the character for an interview. So it tells you what you have to do, but it doesn't tell you how to do it. And that is to me, the beauty of a system like BX is that it leaves it up to the referee to figure out how those details are going to work and what works for his or her game the best and for his or her players and campaign, right? You're going to see a very different approach when we get to advanced D&D because advanced D&D plays very, very differently. And then it says, next, the character must explain the duties of the job to the NPC and offer a rate of pay. The DM must decide what a good rate of pay would be, but this usually includes a guaranteed minimum fee and a partial share of any treasure found. Fees should vary depending on the skills of each retainer and the number available. Employers are expected to buy equipment and food for their retainers as well as pay their fees. Generally, if there are only a few jobs offered but many people looking for work, retainers may agree to work for less pay and vice versa. So supply and demand, right? And then it's going to have you make a reaction roll just like in original D&D AD&D. It's just the table's different. Once the rate of pay is offered, the DM must roll 2d6 on the retainer reaction to see if the offer is accepted, refused, or if more negotiation is necessary. And then it says you can adjust the reaction roll by +1 or 2 for good offers, or by -1 or -2 for poor offers, or if the PC has a bad reputation. And then it talks here about retainer reactions. And so a roll of 2 is not going to be that the person attacks you. It's just going to say they're going to refuse the offer. And then it says also -1R, that's -1 reaction. So that means after you've rolled a 2 the first time in that town to try to hire people, every other time that you try to hire someone in that town, you're going to take a -1 to your reaction roll. Not even at the same tavern, in the same town. Because people have heard about you and how you botched trying to hire this person, and they don't have confidence that you're going to lead them on a good adventure. And so you're going to take a negative to that roll. And then if you roll a 12, they accept the offer and they're going to add +1 to their morale score. Okay. And then everything in between is either they're going to refuse the offer, you're going to roll again on a 6 to 8, and then you're going to offer accepted on a 9 through 11. Okay. And then it says the level of retainers. The retainer may be of any level, 0, 1, 2, or 3 or higher, and of any class, normal, man, or a character class. And then it says retainers can never be higher in level than the PC who hires them. And then it says elvish and dwarvish ones should be rare. And and then it talks about why. It says elves are long-lived, but there aren't that many of them, and dwarves are long-lived, but not as much as elves. And there's not that many of them, more than elves, but less than humans. That's how it kind of describes it. And then it talks about the loyalty, and it says the loyalty is a retainer of a retainer is a measure of the retainer's morale and willingness to take risks for the PC and not run away in the face of danger. A retainer's loyalty or morale is based on the charisma of the player character's employer. So that's going to be up here in the section on character abilities. And it's going to show us that our different charisma scores are going to tell you your adjustment to reactions, which is going to affect that roll when you're rolling to see if they're going to work for you. And then also the number of retainers that you can have, from a minimum of 1 to a maximum of 7 at a charisma of 18, minimum of 1 at a charisma score of 3. And then the morale. So a charisma of 18 is going to give them morale 10, and then a charisma of 3 is going to give them a morale 4. Now, the way that morale works is that anytime you roll the morale or under, it means the character's not going to flee. Okay, so having a morale of 10 is a good thing because on a 2d6, you're going to roll it on a 2d6. And so on 2d6, the options to get them to run away would be if you rolled an 11 or 12. So statistically, that's much less likely, right? Whereas on if your charisma is 3, they have a morale 4. So rolling 5+ on 2d6 is more likely, right? So that's how the morale score works in a game like this. Okay, so that's the loyalty of the character. And then it says the loyalty of retainers should be checked whenever extraordinary danger is met during an adventure. Loyalty should also be checked after each adventure. The DM may wish to adjust a retainer's loyalty due to actions of the player character, such as if the PC pays the retainer more than agreed upon or rescues the retainer from danger and vice versa. So these are all things that came up in my daughter's game. They had retainers die, or henchmen, whatever you want to call them, same thing, retainer, henchman, die during an adventure, and it impacted the morale of all of the other retainers that they had left. And when they came back to town, some of them left the service. They were like, we are not comfortable working for you anymore. Some of them said, we're going to take a break. You can come back and hire us again, but give us some time. Like, we need to deal with this. We need to process that these people died because we've been adventuring with them. And it like struck them. And it was a way to have my players understand, like, there are consequences for the actions. They didn't mean for these characters to die, but they did die. But then other times, like, the cleric had one healing spell. He was a 2nd level cleric, and he could cast Cure Light Wounds once a day. And he used it once to cure a retainer who had been wounded very, very severely. And that affected the morale of all of the other retainers because they saw that he used that spell and that he couldn't do it again, which meant if one of the player characters got hurt, they were in trouble. But they wanted to save this retainer. It was partly for mercenary reasons because they needed that retainer to be able to fight and stay in a fight, but it had a positive effect on the morale. Okay, so those are things that can happen with using these morale rules, and it makes the game really fun. It adds all this layer of you don't know what's going to happen, and it can create chaos during the battle, which I think combat should be chaotic. It shouldn't just come down to die rolls and announcing how much damage you did or what AC you hit. That gets boring. But when you add in these things like, oh, the person next to you looks scared and they just dropped their sword and they're running away, that completely changes the tenor of the combat, because now the other characters are going to see that the other retainers are going to see that retainer ran, and then it could force them to make another morale check. Like it's things like that can make the game really, really fun. Okay. So I think that's a good way of looking at it. Then it talks about experience. It says retainers will earn experience from adventures just like player characters do, and may rise a level in their character class once they have gained enough experience points. Retainers, however, only receive half of the experience PCs would receive, because they were only following orders and not making decisions on their own. Retainers may be awarded more than their agreed upon portion of the treasure, and thus gain more experience than normal. Retainers' earned experience is adjusted by character class adjustments due to their abilities. So there's a few things there that we need to talk about. So let's just deal with the last one first. So that adjustment to experience points, what that's talking about is you have to know what their ability scores are, because if they have a high or low ability score in their prime requisite, they're going to get a bonus or a penalty to their earned experience points. So let's say in the course of an adventure, you had a fighter retainer who had a strength of 15. That means that character is going to get plus 10% to their earned experience points. So on an adventure, if they earned 100 experience points, and because the player characters would get 200, right? Because the retainer is only going to get half, it says. Well, that retainer would get 100 and then an extra 10%, so 110, right? That's what that's talking about. So then what's it talking about with the treasure? And it says, oh, well, if you give them a share of treasure, then they're going to earn more experience points. That's because of what I was just talking about earlier, which is that in these versions of the game, you earned experience points mostly from treasure. You do get experience points from killing monsters in original or early editions of D&D, but it's much, much less than you're going to get from earning treasure. And so this was how the game was built. You gain experience points by getting treasure. You get treasure by going into dungeons and finding treasure that's in there, and ideally surviving the experience so that you can come back to town and keep and or spend the treasure and then get the associated experience points. So it wasn't about killing monsters, and usually you didn't want to kill the monster because you didn't want to go into combat. Combat was a risk. So you might do something to try to distract the dragon to make it leave the lair, and then you run in and grab the treasure and then get out as quickly as you can. And you don't fight the dragon at all, because the real experience is going to come from all the gold that you just got. But again, in order to carry all that gold, you need people to help you do that, right? So that's how all these concepts tie together. So once you start to go away from the idea that you need gold for experience points, then you start to get away from the idea, well, then why do I need someone to carry the gold? Because who cares? Like if you're not tying experience to gold, I mean, yeah, if you want gold to buy stuff, but usually in more modern games, the treasure's not really gold. It's like magic items. And in these versions of the games, at least my memory serves, is that you don't get experience points for magic. You get it for gold. So, and it could be like paintings, things that can be converted into gold. It doesn't just have to be gold pieces. It could be artworks, statues. It could be, whatever it is, things that can be, like I said, converted into gold value. But if it's a magic +2 sword, you wouldn't necessarily get the gold piece value for that for your experience points, because the reward for that is that you got a magic sword. Okay. So that's what they're talking about there. Now let's deal with this half experience points versus the player character, and how do you calculate that? So a lot of people do this very, very differently. Everyone seems to have a different interpretation of what this means. In Old School Essentials, which is a modern retro clone, but it is a faithful adaptation of BX D&D, the way that they do it in there is it says that when you figure out the experience points, you're going to count up all the player characters as 1 per, and then you're going to count up each retainer as half per. And then you're going to create a number, and then you're going to divide the total experience points that you're giving out for that adventure based on the treasure that they gained and the monsters that they killed. You're going to take that total number, divide it by the number that you calculated between, half point for the retainers and 1 point for the player characters. And that's going to determine the number of experience points that you get. And then the retainers will get half of what that amount is. So as an example, let's say that the characters earned 2,000 experience points on an adventure, and there were 4 player characters and 2 retainers. So the 4 player characters are going to count as 1 each, so that's 4. The 2 retainers are going to count as half each, so that's 5. So you've got 2,000 divided by 5, that's 400 experience points. So the player characters are going to get 400, and then the retainers are going to get 200 each, right? Because there's 2 of them and they're going to get half the number of experience points. That's how Old School Essentials says to deal with this way of figuring out the experience. Some people don't do it that way. Everyone has a different way of doing it. So share yours in the comments below and let me know how you approach this idea of giving out experience points. Now, I will tell you, in my daughter's game, this is going to make a lot of old schoolers maybe surprised, I guess. Some of them might think I'm doing it wrong, I'm doing it wrong, but I'm doing what works for me. I don't calculate experience points session by session. I don't give out a lot of treasure because I don't want to give out a lot of treasure in my games. So what I do is base it on my previous experience of like roughly how many experience points did my characters earn when I was a kid, and, sort of remembering like how long it took them to level. And then I kind of just flatten that out. And I also base it on just the number of times that we play. And every 7 to 10 adventures, I'll just tell them, you've gained X number of experience points to account for the past few sessions or whatever. And then everybody gets the same, but then the retainers get half of that amount. So as an example, at a certain point we were playing and it had been about maybe 12 sessions or so. It might have even been more. I said, okay, everybody earns 2,000 experience points. And that meant that the thief and the fighter got to go to second level, and everybody else, the cleric got to go to second level. So there was no magic users in the party. Had there been, they wouldn't have been able to move up. But the elves didn't get to go up because the elves in this version of the game need 4,000 experience points to go up to second level. So that's how I handled the experience points. And so I don't have to deal with them having a lot of treasure and then figuring out how to spend it and all that kind of stuff. I just do my experience points that way. And so we've been playing for 5 years. So it's September, like I said, September 11th of 2025. We started playing in October of 2020. We used to try to play once every month, and now we'll go like, once a month for like 2-3 months in a row. And then we'll have like a hiatus of like 4 months and then we'll come back. It's just based on everyone's schedules. The girls are so busy. They're all in high school now. They're taking AP classes. They're doing college prep stuff. They're getting their driver's licenses, and they all have different activities that they do. They're all very busy. So we play when we can play, right? But we've been playing for that long. Well, the elves are second level, and the cleric is third level, and the thief is fourth level. The fighter has left the group. So, I've had people in the past, they tell me that I'm way too harsh as a DM, that my players must not have any fun, that I'm mean as a DM, and that I'm doing it wrong. And I get all those statements. I totally get that. And the thing is, it's wrong for you. If you say that and it's wrong for you, then it's wrong for you. It's not wrong for me. And it's not wrong for my players. They've never complained. They love playing, and they also don't have any context to think that they should be leveling any quicker. And there's never been a thing of like, when are we going to go up and level? Like, it never happens. It just happens when it happens. So I like slower paced games like this, and I love lower level play where you're exploring your character. So that's just me, but that's how I deal with my experience points for my retainers. And again, I'd love to hear your ideas in the comments below. Now, another thing that we have in the BX version here, besides just those followers, is these specialists. Okay, so this is on page X21 to match the B21 where they were talking about retainers in the basic book. This is the expert book. So it talks about specialists and mercenaries, and it's going to break them up and basically say, during the game, players may need to hire NPCs with training or special skills in a certain area. These people are known as specialists. They're not retainers, and they will not go on adventures, but you can hire as many specialists as can be afforded, so it's not based on your charisma, and they're located by posting notices, and the DM should decide the cost for posting the notice. The ad may be answered by none, one, or many persons depending on the DM's direction or decision, and it can be influenced by the type of specialist wanted, the size of the local population, the reputation of the employer, and the amount of money or bonus offered. So again, this leaves it up to the DM to figure all that out, but it just tells you have to consider these things, but you decide how much you want it to cost and all that kind of stuff. And then the player must then select who to hire from the applicants and work out the details of the salary with each. And the DM takes the role of the NPCs, so that you're going to role play, and the player is going to have their character offer a rate, and then as the DM, you're going to role play whether you accept the offer or you counter or like whatnot, right? And you're going to roll those reaction dice. That's going to affect it as well. So mercenaries are hired soldiers who would typically do army work. Like specialists, they will usually not go on dungeon adventures and will only participate in wilderness adventures such as fighting other armies, clearing the land of monsters around a castle, and defending the castle. So you should be aware of the morale of your mercenaries, because high death rates, low pay, and other unappealing entertainment or treatment will cause them to revolt or desert their lord. Good treatment and safe but exciting service will lead to greater loyalty, as will success on the battlefield. And then it gives you descriptions and example costs. So you've got alchemists, armors, animal trainers, engineers, sages. And then it continues over here. You've got seamen and spies, and then you've got your mercenaries and all the different troop types. So you've got your non-fighters or peasants. So those are like your torchbearers. Your non-fighter peasants are probably 0 level, and like I said, torchbearers, porters. You might leave someone behind to watch your horses when you go into the dungeon. So they're not an animal handler. They're just watching your horses, or they're watching over the camp. Those kinds of people, right? Those are your peasants, your 0 levels, non-fighters. And then you've got lightfoot, marines, heavyfoot, archers, crossbowmen, longbowmen, all these different kinds. They all cost a different amount. And then also the race, whether they're human, elf, dwarf, or goblin, can affect the rates. And then you've got, again, a summary here of all your different expert types, your alchemists and stuff, and how much they cost. So, again, if you watch the game that I run for my daughter and her friends there, I do have an animal trainer in that game. He does not cost anywhere near this much. And it's because I don't give them as much gold. I don't give them as much treasure as I talked about. So they couldn't afford to pay him 500 gold a month, but they needed an animal trainer. So I had to work it into the game as like how that came about. Okay, but that's how BX deals with those kind of higher level specialists and mercenaries. Now let's look at how this version of the game, BX, deals with the concept of followers. So just as a reminder, in this version of the game, dwarf, elf, and halfling are classes. They are not races. Okay, it says character classes. So it's going to tell us when clerics reach 9th level, so instead of 8th, now it's 9th, they may choose to construct a castle. If they have not lost favor with their deity, the cost of the building the castle will be half the normal amount. So that's exactly like it was in original D&D. It says, so if a cleric spends 50,000 gold on the castle, the cleric would actually be able to build a structure that normally costs 100,000. Furthermore, once the castle is completed, and then once again, we're going to get this term, fanatically loyal troops, the faithful who never need to check morale, will come to defend the cleric. And there will be from 50 to 300 soldiers, 5d6 times 10, from 1 to 2nd level, armed with various weapons. And it's up to the DM to determine their exact composition. Okay, so that's that. Now, dwarves, when they reach 9th level, they can build a stronghold and attempt to establish a clan. Stronghold will be underground, blah, blah, blah. It talks about many different clans of dwarves, but usually all members of the same clan will live together. Dwarven clans are generally more friendly with each other and may join forces in times of need. Dwarven lords may only hire dwarven mercenaries, but specialists and retainers of other races may be offered for other positions. So they don't get followers automatically. It says you can build a clan, but like you have to figure out how those dwarves are going to come move there. Okay, now elves are going to build a forest stronghold. Okay, that is going to work with nature, and they're going to become friends with all of the animals that live around there and within 5 miles. And those animals are able to warn of approaching strangers, carry news of events. So the animals kind of like are your followers in a way, right? Because they can give you news, carry news of events, deliver short messages, etc. And in return for those services, the animals will expect help and protection from the elves. Okay, but if you want elves to be in your stronghold, you're going to have to acquire them somehow, which probably means paying them to move there, right? Or however the DM wants to deal with it. Now, fighters, same thing. They can build a castle at level 9 and become a baron and clear the land, but they don't automatically get followers. Halflings can build a stronghold. And again, they don't automatically get followers. It says it may attract a whole community of halfling. So it really depends on how you want to interpret that. If it says it may attract, that could be up to the DM to say, yeah, halflings just show up and you don't pay for them. And the same with these other ones, elves, fighters, dwarfs. You know, if you're starting a dwarven clan, maybe you're going to interpret that as that, well, you build the stronghold and then dwarves just show up. It's just interesting that clerics are very specific. It tells you these fanatically loyal, meaning they're not going to check morale and you're not paying them. You're paying for their room and board and, you know, probably equipment that they need maybe, or, you know, whatever. But they're not serving you because they're paying you. They're serving you because they are fanatically loyal servants of the faith. Okay. So that's fighters, that's halfling. And then magic users are going to build a tower at 11th level. Now, this one does tell you when they build a tower, they're going to gain 1 to 6 apprentices of levels 1 to 3. And then thieves are going to build a hideout And then when that happens, they're going to attract 2 to 12 first level thieves who've come to learn under a master. So some magic user and thief are very specific that it tells you this happens automatically. It's not armies of followers like what the cleric gets, but you get apprentices and, is either magic users or thieves, right? So that's how BX deals with this concept of followers. And again, this idea of followers, it's going back to the expected end game of original D&D and of these versions of D&D, where the idea was you were playing an adventurer that might eventually become a hero, but your goal was to become a landowner, to own a domain that you ruled over, and then you have all these people that live on your property or the land that you own. Some of them are going to help you manage your castle and things like that. Some of them are going to be soldiers to defend it, that kind of thing. And at that point, you're probably going to retire your character because you've done what you set out to do. You've hit your goal. That is a very different way of playing than in modern D&D, where you start out and you're already a hero. You are a super person at level 1, and then you're there to just get better and to do these like universe spanning, conquests and things to become, almost godlike in these types of games. It's a very different approach, but domain level play is not usually a goal in like say 5th edition D&D. Now I know that they did, I think last year publish or year before publish a book for 5th edition on domain style play and doing that kind of thing. I don't have that book, so I don't know how it works and what the implications are for doing that. But people don't really talk about it. I don't get the impression it was a very popular book. But maybe it is. You guys tell me, you 5th edition players out there, is that something that you've tried? But it's not really part of the DNA. I mean, it was an optional book, right? So it's not part of the game rules of 5th edition, the core rules, where again, it's built into BX. This just says at 9th level, this happens. You can do this and you get all these followers that show up. And then at that point, would you leave your land to keep adventuring? I mean, you could absolutely, but most people didn't. Now, BECMI's going to deal with that different, but like I said, I'm not talking about that now. It's not really part of this discussion. Okay. But, the fundamental concept of these followers in this domain level play again goes all the way back to those war game roots. So I'm just to kind of try to keep hitting that one, let people know that's why it existed. Okay, so that is our look at original D&D and BX. Next up, we're going to talk about 1st edition AD&D. Okay, now we're going to get into 1st edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons and look at how these concepts are dealt with in here. So there are discussions about henchmen and hirelings here in the Player's Handbook, and it is in the equipment section. And I mention that because it's going to be relevant when we get to 2nd edition Advanced D&D. But after the list of, equipment and weapons and armor, you have this section here on hirelings and henchmen. So here, very specifically, they're going to break out the difference between the two. And it's going to say hirelings at any time a character may attempt to hire various different sorts of workers, servants, or guards. The success of such hiring is entirely dependent upon the availability of the type desired, wage and bonus offers, and to some extent the character's charisma. Typical hirelings are alchemist, armorer, bearer, blacksmith, crossbowman, engineer, link boy, man-at-arms, steward, teamster, or valet. Your character will have to locate the whereabouts of whatever type of hireling taken service. And then it says employment can be by the hour, day, week, month, or year, depending on the desires of the character and the agreeability of the person to be hired. Your referee will handle all such matters as they occur. And then it says, note that the number of hirelings is in no way limited by the charisma, and hirelings differ considerably from henchmen, who are discussed immediately hereafter. The loyalty of hirelings is quite similar to that of henchmen, though, and the discussion of the loyalty of henchmen can be applied to hirelings in all sorts. Okay, and so then it goes into henchmen, and it says, as discussed in the preceding section regarding character abilities, charisma has a great effect on the number of henchmen a character is able to attract. So we're on page 39 here. I'm going to quickly flip backwards, though, to look at the charisma score and how it's going to talk about it being having an impact. Okay, and very similar to what we've seen before, it's just, handled a little bit differently. So it's going to tell you on a score of 3 to 18, the maximum number of henchmen you can hire, which is going to be 1 at a charisma of 3 and 15 at a charisma of 18. And then it's going to tell you the loyalty base of your character. So anything between 9 and 13 is going to be normal. 14 and above, you're going to get a bonus to your loyalty, and 8 and below, you're going to get a penalty. But the loyalty base is based on a percentage. So it's not a flat number like a 1 or a 2, like we saw before. I think 3 was the highest. It's a percentage, and that's because Gary's going to change morale and loyalty in here. Instead of being on a 2d6 table, he's going to change it to a D percentage. So just cause, he's just changing it. Now, there's a variety of reasons for that. Gary loved percentages. He also loved different kinds of dice, but partly I think he changed it just so that he could say it was different, because remember, in AD&D, one of the claims that he's making is that this is a wholly new game, and it is separate and distinct and different from Dungeons and Dragons. This is Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and it's a different game. Okay, and there's whole reasons why he said that. I've gone into them here before on the channel. Okay, but that's your charisma. Okay, and it says, a henchman is more or less a devoted follower of a character. In return for the use of his or her abilities and talents, the henchman receives support, lodging, and a share of his or her master's or mistress's earnings in the form of stipends as a share of treasure taken. Henchmen are always of a character race and character class, but are never player characters. Okay, and then it says the alignment should be compatible with the player that the character serves. It'll usually be necessary for your character to visit various inns and drinking establishments in search of henchmen. It is also possible that a number of notices will have to be posted, perhaps in conjunction with the employment of a crier to announce the employment offered. The cost of such is often high in rounds of drinks, food, tips, gratuities, bribes, fees, and so forth. The costs are in addition to the actual sums paid to the henchmen eventually employed. Locating non-human characters such as dwarves, elves, and like might be even more protracted and difficult. So it talks about that a little bit. And then it says, once the henchman's brought into the character's service, it'll be necessary to pay a wage plus support and upkeep. Your referee will inform you as to such costs. When a henchman accompanies your character on adventures, he or she must be given a portion of the treasure, both money and magic, just as a player character would. However, the share can be lesser, for all of the henchman's expenses are paid for by his master or mistress. Naturally, it is a good idea to give a henchman as much treasure as possible, for in that way the henchman gains experience points. Again, same system, XP for gold. Experience awarded to henchmen is usually much less than that which would be given to a player character, and this is because the henchmen are acting under the direction of their master or mistress. So you should expect that your character's henchmen will get about 50% of the experience points, which they share in the slaying of opponents and garnered treasure actually totals. Possibly even less if your character bore the brunt of the action and closely directed the henchmen. The loyalty of henchmen is based upon many factors. Charisma of the player character is important. Remuneration, support, upkeep, wages, bonuses, and sharing of treasure also play a big part. The involvement of henchmen in adventuring is important, as are the activities of the character and what he requires of the henchman during the course of adventuring. For example, and then it says, assuming the character has above average charisma, he or she could be somewhat less than generous in remuneration, but still have henchmen with average loyalty. But their loyalty is going to go up if the charisma is higher and if the remuneration is exceptional, etc. So actions to protect the lives and welfare of the henchmen or saving the life of a resurrecting henchman gives loyalty that's above average. And then it says disloyalty will come into play in combat and other stress situations. Disloyal henchmen will betray or desert their master or mistress. So that's an awesome sentence to say, because it's giving you so much role-playing potential. Betray or desert. So desert, okay, fine, they run away, but betray is pretty strong. I like that approach. So you can see here the way it works is very similar to what we saw in BX. It's just it's lengthier, but also you'll see there's no rules in here, and that's because the rules for that are going to be in the DM's guide. That's just the way Gary wrote this game. The player's handbook doesn't have a lot of things that you would think would be in it. A lot of that stuff ends up being in the Dungeon Master's Guide, because a lot of that stuff Gary thought players didn't have any need to see that stuff. So Gary was very much about, like, the Dungeon Master has that screen and everything happens behind that screen. And that's to allow the Dungeon Master to kind of make up what he wants based on what he wants to do. Gary was very big on that. So, you'll hear a lot of old school players say, like, roll the dice and let them roll where they, let them fall where they may. And if the player character dies, that's just what happens. And that's fine. And I rolled most of my dice in view of my players, unless it's something that they shouldn't know. And then I roll it secret. But Gary didn't always play that way. So to say that, like, all old schoolers played that way, that's not true at all. Gary at one point said you don't really even need rules, but he very specifically also said sometimes he would, I'm paraphrasing, but so he would roll dice and then just make up the result of what he wanted to have happen, but the dice made it look like he was abiding by the dice. And I know a lot of old timers probably freak out at that, but that's just how Gary did it. So, but anyway, I like the approach here of how henchmen are talked about. Now, it does very specifically talk about morale. So let's flip over and talk about that. As I mentioned, this is a topic I talked about before in that one video. So you can learn more about that there, but it's going to get into morale, but it's not going to tell you how to calculate. It's just going to tell you what happens. Morale properly refers to the state of mind of troops during combat or stretch situations. Stupid creatures tend to fight to the death, and so do creatures with a set purpose in mind. Elite, guards, and fantastical creatures. Your character never has to check morale, nor will any other player character, but some are brave, some foolish, some cautious, some cowardly. Your character's henchmen will probably have to check morale, and so too will hirelings. Powerful monsters will never check, and even weak ones will probably not do so as long as they have leadership. So it just talks about the concept of morale here. Again, you can learn more about that in the other video, but this is telling you that you're going to have to figure, it's from time to time, you're going to have to check for your henchmen. Okay, so now what are the rules then? How do the rules work for henchmen in here? Well, we're going to find that again, as I mentioned, in the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's going to start here on page 28. I think that is, yes. So, hirelings. And really quickly, we've got half a page starting here. So that's half, one, so that's 1.5, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5, 5.5, 6.5, 7.5, 8.5, 9. 9 pages to talk about hirelings and henchmen. That's how important they were in Gary's mind in a game of Dungeons and Dragons, to take 9 pages out of this book. It's a big book, I'll grant you, but we haven't seen anything like that in other editions. So Gary's going to write a lot. Now, a lot of that is going to be explaining what these different specialist types are. So that's part of the reason why this section is so long. But he talks about hirelings, and then he gives costs for different types: bearers and porters, carpenters, leather workers. If you're listening instead of watching, you can come back and check out the table here. It gives you the daily and monthly costs. And then it defines what all those characters are. And then it tells you the location, where to find them, and like what size town you have to be in, employment of standard hirelings and how that works, their duties, and then you have your expert hirelings and where to find those kinds of experts. And so the various types of hirelings listed below will generally be found in the appropriate section of the community: the Street of Smiths, Weapons Way, Armorer's Alley, etc. And then it talks about monthly costs for those. And then you have, these are like your specialists. You can see the list here. It's very similar to what we saw in the expert set. It's just longer. It's more detailed. You see all these different kinds here: engineers, artillerists, sappers, miners, jewelers and gem cutters, sages, scribes, ship crew, etc. Okay, so then it's going to define all these and how much they cost to go into service. And there's going to be this very long section on sages. A lot of this is very similar to what we saw in the Blackmore supplement for D&D, but just expanded, right? So that's that whole section there. Goes all the way through there, and then it gets to your henchmen. Now, there's some really interesting stuff in here. Henchmen, whether male or female, are greatly desired by the discerning players, for they usually spell the difference between failure and success in the long-term view. So it's telling you, again, it's expected that you're going to do this. This is 1979, 5 years after the game's been published, and Gary's still talking about this idea that you're going to want henchmen. So it was a thing back then. It was very, very common. They are useful in individual adventures as a safety measure against the machinations of rival player characters, provide strength to the character and his or her stronghold, and lastly serve as a means of adventuring when the player character is unable to. Because they're so useful and because they're typically so devoted, there are charisma limitations as to how many henchmen a PC is able to attract. Knowing this, the real question for the Dungeon Master is who will be attracted, where will they be found, and when will they come, and what will the cost be? And so then this next section here answers all that questions. But let's go back and look at 2 very important things from that section. So I'm going to go backwards first, and the first one is the section where it talks about they serve to be able to adventure in the dungeon when the player character couldn't do that. Why wouldn't you? If you're at the game and you can play your henchman, why couldn't you play your player character? Because in these versions of the game, remember, again, we talked about this in that video on those forgotten concepts. There was this concept called one-to-one time, which is that when time passed in between the dungeons and when your character wasn't in the dungeon and you weren't playing the game, in the real world, the amount of time that passed is how much time passed in the game world. So just to be clear on what I mean by that, you're in a dungeon and you're delving and you find a bunch of gold or like whatever you find. You do what you got to do. You come out of the dungeon and you go into town. So you're at your safe spot, whatever your safe spot is, like your guild or your inn or your camp. You've gone somewhere where you feel relatively safe and you stop and you're going to be there. And at that point, your character's no longer adventuring or gaining experience points, but time in the game world is going to pass on a 1-for-1 basis of the amount of time that passes in the real world until you game again. So gamers back then were keen to want to try to play as often as possible so that they weren't wasting time. But if you went a week between sessions, that meant a week passed in the game world. Now, this is important because there were multiple people and multiple groups of players adventuring in the same dungeon in the same world. And so while your character spent a week of time not playing, other characters could be in there doing things, and then the world would have changed by the time you came back. Treasure's been found, people have been killed, whatever has happened. And so you wanted to play as often as possible. So that's the short version of 1-for-1 time. And again, see that other video and you can learn more about why that existed and how it worked. But one of the things that player characters could do, specifically magic users, that was mostly them that were going to do this, they could research spells and they could create new spells or magic items. And there are rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide for how to do this and how long it takes. But what would happen is a player character would realize that they had a need for a certain spell that wasn't fulfilled by the existing spells in the player's handbook. But a situation arose where they would be like, I wish that I had a spell that did XYZ. So any of those named spells in the player's handbook in Advanced D&D, like Big Beast Crushing Hand or like Drawmage's Instant Summons, all those spells, those were named after the player character that created that spell in the game because the player had a need for that type of spell. And they asked the DM if they could research that spell. And it wound its way into being a core part of the game because those spells became popular. So it was a very common thing to research these spells, but it takes a very long time. And so a lot of times you would have a player character who would not retire, but like put his character on hiatus for weeks or months at a time to research a new spell, but they don't want to stop playing the game. So they would pick up and play one of that character's henchmen until the player character was able to finish researching that spell and come back into the game. That's what he's talking about when he says that you can play a character. If the player character is not available, you can play the henchman. Okay. Now, the other thing in there that I find very, very interesting is it says, oh, well, it can protect your player character against the machinations of rival player characters. Well, what's that talking about? Well, it's related to what I was just saying, this idea that there's multiple groups of players playing in the same dungeon, and they're competing because the dungeon doesn't get restocked for every group that comes through. Gary's treating it like a living entity. So if group A goes into the dungeon on Saturday at noon and kills the goblins and takes their treasure, and then when group B comes into the dungeon on Sunday night at whatever time it is, and a week has passed for both groups since they've been playing, then it's been like a week and a day for group B, right? So by the time they get into the goblin cave, the goblins are all dead, but also the treasure's all gone. So these were competitive groups. They're like rival adventuring groups. And I use a rival adventuring group in my daughter's game, but it's a group of NPCs. And there's one group. Gary's got multiple groups, and they're all vying to be the first to explore particular areas in the dungeon so that they can get the treasure that the other groups aren't going to get, right? That was one of the ways that Gary played. So when he says protecting you against the machinations of other player characters, these other player characters from rival groups are out to try to stop you and keep you from getting all the treasure. And so, you know, maybe they try to bribe your henchmen or try to like get like them to turn on you or betray you, like all these different kinds of things. These are all things that are happening. And so that's what he's talking about there. Your henchmen can help protect you against other player characters. It's not other player characters from your own party necessarily. It's other player characters in the game from rival adventuring parties that you might not never run into because you're playing at different times. You might run into them, but you might not. So it goes all through here and talks about that, and then how to hire them, the costs and all that kind of thing. And then it's going to get into how to equip them. You have to pay for the equipment. and then the loyalty, and it's going to go through the loyalty. Now, what it's going to say here is if they fail their loyalty check, and it's going to tell you how often you have to check. So that's going to be details in here. The initial loyalty is modified by subsequent factors in the continuing relations between liege and his or her henchmen and hirelings. And it says loyalty is important when trouble arises, whether it is some insidious plot from within, a challenge from a rival, or in adventures or warfare. Typical situations which require a check for loyalty, obedience, or morale are shown hereafter. Checks are made by adjustment of the base loyalty score. The final total is compared to the result of the percentile dice roll, and if the total is less than the number shown on the dice, the figure or figures in question are disloyal, disobedient, or have poor morale. So it's going to tell you over here that your base morale is 50% plus or minus that charisma adjustment, right? So this is why charisma is important in old school games. It is very, very important. It's not the dump stat like people treated it in 3rd, 4th, and 5th editions. Or some people even like in 2nd edition, because if you aren't using hirelings and henchmen and using reaction rolls, charisma seems like a waste. But if you're playing the way that the authors intended, which is that you are using henchmen and hirelings, charisma is one of the most powerful stats, because the morale of your hirelings and your henchmen is directly related to your charisma score. So if the base is 50%, but you have a charisma bonus that gives you plus 30%, their 80% loyalty score is way better. But if your charisma was your dump stat and you have a negative, then their morale or their loyalty is going to be less than 50%. And that's going to get you into trouble, because if they fail that roll, if they're bribed and they fail, they're going to cooperate with the person that's bribing them. If they're ordered to testify against you and they fail, they're going to agree to testify. If they have a chance to steal goods and they fail that loyalty check, they're going to steal from you. They can desert. They can run away. They can surrender. They can refuse to do a thing that you want. I mean, it's just nuts, the kinds of thing. And again, this is role-playing gold for people who like story-based games, to have these characters in the game that are like wild cards and you don't know what's going to happen, because as a player, you might not know what their loyalty is. Because this is all in the DM's guide of how this works, right? And so this creates opportunities, again, for some really immersive storytelling, while sticking within that old school tradition of, resource management and all that kind of stuff that we were talking about. Okay, so that is the 1st edition on hirelings and henchmen. Now let's go back to look at quickly the followers section in here. Okay, and see what happens with different characters. So this is, again, going to be something where we're going to see that high-level characters are going to attract followers. So the cleric very specifically is going to attract fanatically loyal followers. Okay, it tells us that starting at 8th level. Okay, and it's going to tell us how many they're going to get, between 20 and 200. Okay, so, and those are men-at-arms. And then all characters, I'm not going to go through all this, but all the characters in here get something, right? So fighters are going to attract a body of men-at-arms that serve as mercenaries and that kind of thing. So this one starts to get more specific, that every high-level character is going to attract some kind of follower, all right? So that's advanced D&D and how it deals with this idea. And again, these followers, it's all related to this idea of like building these strongholds and having that be the end goal for your character, very similar to what we saw in BX. The details for this are much more detailed, because that's what advanced D&D is. It's being very, very detailed. So there's no question. There's no room for referee needing to make rulings, because it's all explained in here. And that was very deliberate. And I've talked all about that in other videos on advanced D&D and why that was the design choice. There's differences in pay scales and contracts and obligations, but in general, it works in a similar manner to what we saw in BX. So that's 1st edition advanced D&D.
If you would like to support Daddy Rolled a One, there are now 4 ways to do so. The first is that you can become a patron. Just go to patreon.com/daddyrolledaone and sign up to receive exclusive monthly content, including system-neutral random tables, bonus videos for content that didn't make it to YouTube, eventually a Discord server for Daddy Rolled a One patrons, and one of the coolest features, I think, which are short mini old school adventures with artwork and maps that are only available to my patrons. These aren't reused maps that you can find online. They are only available to my patrons. So again, it's patreon.com/daddyrolledaone, or see the link in the show notes.
You can also become a super fan of the channel and join this list of other fine folks who have contributed to the channel as a thank you to me for all the time and effort that goes into researching, recording, and editing the videos. And you'll get your name listed here in basically perpetuity in all future videos for becoming a super fan. You can also buy some merchandise from my shop. You can buy a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, or tote bag from my spread shop, or you can get paper goods like stickers, posters, and notebooks from Redbubble, all of those featuring exclusive designs only found at my shop, Daddy Rolled the One. And a lot of those are things I partnered on, again, with my friend Bill Green, who is working with me on my Patreon. And then lastly, you can buy my supplement, Alchemy, Explosives, and Inventions, kickstarted last summer of 2024, and available now on DriveThruRPG. It's got lots of expert style characters, and actually I'm going to be talking about some specifics of this book later in this particular video on Henchmen and Hirelings, so I'll just save it for that, but you'll find a link to where you can find that in the show notes below. Thanks so much for your support. Okay, now let's go briefly and talk about second edition. Now, what's interesting here is that they are going to talk about Henchmen and Hirelings, but they're going to move it out of the section on equipment and put it in chapter 12, NPCs. Okay, and they're going to talk about hirelings and list the kinds that you could hire. They're going to talk about followers and mention those because this game does have followers just like 1E does. And then henchmen. So very similar style, very similar breakout as far as the kinds that you can have. And then it's going to talk about the player character obligations that you would have for a hireling. But notice that there's no mechanics in here. Well, very similarly then to what we saw in first edition, those mechanics are going to be moved to the Dungeon Master's Guide, which is a book I don't own for second edition because, if you've followed the channel long enough, I actually never played second edition. I bought some of the books, not all of them. I refer to them constantly and I borrow ideas from them in games that I run. But at the time, my group had switched to Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. So I never played second edition, so I don't have the Dungeon Master's Guide. But you can see some screenshots here of the kind of discussions that they talk about, rates and things like that. It is nowhere near as detailed as what we saw in first edition. And also, I just think the concept that they moved it out of the equipment chapter, which equipment means like you're equipping your character, here's the thing that you're going to want to buy, hirelings and henchmen, and they move it into a chapter on NPCs. There's starting to be a shift. There's definitely a shift in what we're talking about as far as using henchmen and hirelings. All right, now very briefly, I want to talk about the Wizards of the Coast editions of D&D only as a comparison, okay? So the concept of hirelings and henchmen in the Player's Handbook, year 2000, has completely gone away. So it's not dealt with in here at all. Classes don't get followers as they go up in level. That's not a thing. All right, so where we're going to see the concept that's anywhere close to an original kind of look at hirelings and henchmen is going to be in the section on feats. So feats, again, are not something that existed in those earlier editions of D&D. There's kind of a similar thing in the late second edition era, players' options like skills and powers and all that kind of stuff, but I'm not talking about that right now. Okay, but there is a feat here called leadership. And it says the leadership feat is described in the Dungeon Master's Guide. Okay, so let's go over and look at the Dungeon Master's Guide. What does this have to say about the leadership feat? Well, it tells us that you are the sort of person others want to follow, and you have done some work attempting to recruit cohorts and followers. So you have to be at least 6th level, and then you take this feat, and it enables you to attract loyal companions and devoted followers or subordinates. Okay, and basically it's based on your leadership score, which is a combination of your level combined with your charisma bonus and or penalty. Okay, so if you had no charisma bonus or penalty and you were level 6 when you took this feat, you would gain a 4th level cohort, which is like a henchman. Okay, but this is someone who is following you, but they have higher levels, right? So that is going to be your cohort, sort of like going to become your second in command. Okay, so you're basically taking a feat so that you could run a second character. Second character is not as powerful as you, but the difference between 4th and 6th, actually in 3rd, it makes a pretty big difference. But, still, that's not bad for the cost of a feat, right? Now, if your leadership score is higher, you can see at a certain point, you start to get followers. So 1st level all the way up through 6th level, and then your cohort level is going to go up as well. Okay, so that's the leadership feat, and then just kind of talks about, you can get modifiers. Like if you're great prestige, your leadership modifier goes up +2. If you're cruel, it goes down by 2. Cohort only. If you have a familiar paladin warhorse animal companion, the leadership modifier is -2. Death of a cohort goes down -2. So those are all things that are going to affect that. But this right here, this feat is essentially replacement for all the stuff that we've been talking about. Hirelings, henchmen. It's not to say that you can't hire an alchemist or something like that. It's just not a core part of this game, because this game is assuming that your character is competent, is going to do everything him or herself. And you can just kind of tell the shift, and the shift actually happens here. So if you look at the cover for the first edition advanced D&D Player's Handbook, these are henchmen. I mean, these guys are carrying a box. This guy's pulling a dead body of something that they've killed, getting it out of the hallway. This guy's cleaning a sword. Now, some of these are going to be player characters, but some of these are henchmen. This is an adventuring party. And then in second edition, we have this bold, powerful warrior on a horse. Now, there's another guy back here and there's another guy back here, right? But they are not front and center. There's one guy, and the implication is like, this is the guy, like this is the hero. And then that's repeated in 1983. We get the Beckme line. I talked about that recently with that powerful warrior on the front fighting the dragon. Okay, so the tone of the game starts shifting to this heroic style fantasy that it originally wasn't. It was more grim and gritty sword and sorcery fantasy. You could play it heroic, but the artwork and the rules were written to assume that you were playing a grittier world. Okay, so then by the time you get to third edition, it's gone full heroic. I mean, these covers don't show that. They're meant to look like ancient tomes, but the artwork inside, as you saw some of these, it's very much of the heroic. Like this is your fighter type. I mean, that guy's armed for bear and like he's ready to go. He's not like some guy with a short sword and like, maybe he can afford leather armor at first level. Like that's not what we're doing here. So this is much more focused on the idea that your player characters alone individually are competent and able to do a lot of stuff that in previous editions of the game you would have hired hirelings to do. So the concept goes away so much that in fourth edition, as far as I know, it's not even part of the game. If you know different, leave that in the comments. I only played fourth like maybe 2 or 3 times. And then in fifth edition, I mentioned that there's those sidekicks in that one separate book, and there is a domain level book. I don't have either of those books, but I just get the impression it's not very common. I never see people online talking about their sidekicks. Right. So I don't watch Critical Role or anything like that. So I don't know if it's ever come up in those games. But the impression I get is that those characters are sort of individuals. They're part of an adventuring party, but the party is just the player characters and nobody else. And even in my third edition games that I played in, both that I've run and that I played in, we still used henchmen and hirelings. Like we had NPCs that we paid that adventured with the party to fill in gaps, to fill in holes that we had, because there were certain things that our characters didn't do. Like one third edition game I played, nobody wanted to play a cleric. And so the dungeon master he actually created a druid, but he created an NPC druid that could heal, and he played him, but we had to pay the guy to adventure with us so that he could heal us. And so we still use that concept. And again, I just think it's an idea that's sort of fallen by the wayside. Okay, so I think that, if you are going to use these types of concepts in a current type of game, there's just certain things that you have to look at, and you want to make sure that you're implementing these. And we've kind of talked about them, but I kind of wanted to recap. So morale is very central to this idea, because morale and loyalty, the other one, like it's like a relationship stat almost, creating a relationship with the characters that can evolve over time. But those can affect things, and it can lead to desertion, panic, betrayal, or someone laying their life on the line to protect you. It doesn't always have to be negative, right? Fanatical loyalty can have a character, a henchman, do something above and beyond that saves your player character. And again, that creates a lot of very fun, cool role-playing opportunities. But you also have to pay attention to things like the pay, the contracts, the term of service. What are they expected to get? How much treasure are you sharing? And does that treasure come from the party pot, or does it come specifically out of the share of the person who hired that henchman? So it mentioned it, like it talks about the charisma bonus or penalty it's impacted by the person who's doing the hiring. It's not like a collective party person. So the henchman works for the person who hired them, who made the contract. They're adventuring with the party because they're going along with their liege, the player character, right? But if that player character dies, well, one, what happens to that henchman? Do they move their service to another player character, or do they disappear? But also, when you're paying them, does the player character who hired them pay them out of their own share, like I just said, or do you take it out of the party pot because they helped everybody by being there? Those are things you have to consider. Also, the XP. How are you going to calculate that XP? And how much are they going to get? And are you going to give them extra XP by giving them extra treasure? Because you want them to advance and level quicker so that they'll be more capable. Those are things to consider. And then really the player responsibility. So one of the things that, got mentioned on my Patreon when I asked about this is how hard is it to do this and run all these different characters? It seems like it would make combat very confusing and it would take a long time. It would slow things down. And I don't want that in my combat. And I agree. I hate when combat slows down. Combat is when you want the game to speed up and get more active and exciting and things like that. And so it is needing to keep track of how many of these non-combatants are in the room at the time and what are you doing with them when they're not fighting? Are they cowering in the corner? Do they become obstacles? Do they become, are they threatened by the other enemy? Can they be taken as hostages? All those kinds of things you do have to consider. But usually you would have maybe one or two henchmen, and that is usually manageable. And like in my daughter's game, as far as like henchmen like that, I think at most at any one time, they've adventured with maybe 4 at a time. And one of those times, like I said, 2 of them died and the other 2 kind of either quit or said they needed to take a break. So that's out of at a time we had 6 PCs and 4 hirelings or retainers. And so that was less than 1 per person to kind of manage, right? So even if one person does all the hireling, I think it's okay for other players to play those especially during combat and say what they're going to do to keep things moving. As the Dungeon Master, I think you play the personality of those NPCs. You can assign that to the players if you want. I like to play it as me as the Dungeon Master, which also gives me the ability to say that a hireling is not going to do a task that a player character wants them to do because it's putting them in a very dangerous position that they're not prepared for, right? So, or it's against their personality. If you've established that this person is superstitious or has a fear of a certain thing or whatever, and then the player characters are go do this thing that would be contradictory to that, I think it's okay for the Dungeon Master to say, no, that is against the personality. You should explain why, but that's against that personality of that henchman. You can't send him or her to go do that because they wouldn't do that, right? Even if they're fanatically loyal, but those are things you have to consider. So you want to make sure that you're considering all this stuff so that these henchmen and hirelings don't just turn into meat shields and, cannon fodder. That's not the intent of using these kinds of things. Now, one of the things that you can do to make it easier on yourself as a DM when you're implementing henchmen and hirelings is to kind of have a pre-stocked list. So there is a list in the Dungeon Master's Guide, and it talks about that in the section on henchmen and hirelings. And it says that there's, you can use the NPC personality tables to figure out the personality of your henchmen and hirelings. So it's here on page 100 and 101, but it has all these different traits where you can figure out their alignment, their possessions, their appearance, their sanity, their general tendencies, like are they optimist or pessimistic, or are they loquacious or malevolent, fanatical, obsessive, all those kinds of things. You can figure out their personality. If they're just average, are they modest or egoist, arrogant, friendly? If they're extroverted, are they forceful, overbearing, or just blustering, antagonistic, rude, rash? If they're introverted, are they retiring, aloof, hostile, rude? You can figure out things like their disposition, intellect, nature, materialism, honesty, bravery, energy, thrift, morals, piety. Now, you don't have to roll all those at once. It would be a lot, but maybe a couple of those, put them on a chart or an index card, maybe have a name, have a little quirk like that, have a strength, and have a weakness. So a quirk can be one of these personality traits. A strength might be they're really good at XYZ, whatever it is. And it doesn't have to be combat. It could be they're good at fishing, or they're good at handling animals, or they're good at baking. And then a weakness. And the weakness can be a fear or a superstition, but it could also, a weakness could be they snore very loud. And so people have trouble falling asleep at campsite. Like it, again, these don't have to necessarily have mechanical benefits. You're just looking for a way to distinguish your henchmen and hirelings from each other. And the more you do that, the more your players are going to get attached to them and feel responsible for them. And that's what you're looking for. You want to create that relationship. Okay, so these tables in the DM's Guide are gold for figuring out NPCs on the fly. Page 100 and 101, first edition Dungeon Master's Guide to AD&D. Now, I did something similar in my game for my daughter. I just planned ahead. I knew they were going to go higher because I planned ahead. And they said, next time we're going to go hire NPCs. And so I had this ready. And so over here, you see my tables, terrible handwriting, but I wrote down, so the Grease Goat Tavern, that name comes from Professor Dungeon Master's Dungeon Craft channel, as does the name Scabs the Thief. But I had these NPCs like you saw on the job board, but then I had notes like Radix is dumb and loyal. He misunderstands words. So he'll say things like, oh, she teached me this instead of she taught me. And that endeared him to the players' characters, or the players for some reason. They thought it was very cute. And they kind of took him like he was like a little buddy for them. But then Radler was grim, focused on earning money for his family, and he made those PCs sign that contract like I talked about. Duchess was sarcastic and talkative, but her husband Clemens couldn't get a word in edgewise because his wife always did the talking. Even if he was asked a question, she would answer, and then he would just constantly roll his eyes. And so they were like a partner team. And then I had Eisentrude and Osana. So Eisentrude was naive but skilled. She fidgeted all the time, but she was smart, had really good ideas. And then Osana was very friendly but super cautious, and she adjusted her hair all the time. And then I put some pictures in here that I just, found online. And so this was Osana, and I'm pointing that out. So she's the one that died. So I said in the game, she was like 15. And she was eventually, because she was an orphan, and the player characters did feel responsible for her. And they felt terrible when she died, and her death impacted the other NPCs retainers who basically said they either were going to quit entirely or they were going to take a break because they needed time to process this girl dying, and it affected the players. They were really sad because we've played for so long. We've played for almost 5 years now, but we've been playing for about 2.5 to 3 years when this character died, this NPC. And so, they'd known her for 3 years, and it had a big impact on them. And that's what I wanted. I want them to feel again that connection and, have that feeling of responsibility for those characters. So that's another thing that you can do. Now, if you're looking for other ways that you can make your characters different, give them some quirks, I do have tables that I'm posting on Patreon on my series on how to make your character weird. So I just did one on fighters, like weird fighter traits. And these are little, usually non-mechanical things that you can add to a fighter. But again, give them a quick personality. And these will be things that you don't see anywhere else because it's stuff I created. And so these are ideas that you can use to kind of make two different, like say NPC fighters, very, very different from each other, even though mechanically they might be very, very similar. Okay, and then another thing you can do, and I talked about this earlier, I have a whole book here on these are for ideas for expert player characters, but you can use these for NPCs. So apothecaries, relic hunters, arms crafters, artillerists, sappers. These are all people that your characters could hire, saboteurs. Okay, and then they each come with like fun little tables here. So like the relic hunter, maybe you're hunting for a relic. Well, this will help you generate what relic you're searching for. It'll give a DM an idea. But then maybe you could also hire a relic hunter. So it's patterned after Indiana Jones, has that kind of thing, even though it's a cleric. And so, but you could hire someone to come with you to show you like where to find this thing, right? So there's your relic locations. So this thing is chock full of tables like that. And then it's got 3 new expert character classes: alchemists, demolitionists, and inventors. All of, again, are people that you could hire as NPCs when you're looking for those types of characters and those services. So that's stuff that you can get in that book. Or, there's other similar books out there as well, right? So you can find lots of things like that. But I think, we talked about understanding when to let a DM run them, when to let a player run them, and the considerations of like how big of the town is, how easy are these people going to be to find, etc. So those are all kinds of things that you need to think about and be prepared for. And so hopefully you've got some tools right there to help you as a DM be prepared for when these types of characters come up in a game. Okay, so to kind of wrap up, well, first off, let's talk about why these concepts disappeared. And, we've kind of touched on it already, but you start to see it already kind of fading away in the 2nd edition era. And then you get into the WotC era, where it is a focus on that heroic spotlight and balanced party size, and not about having tons and tons of characters. And henchmen are seen as slowing down the game. That's a real concern that a lot of people have. And I can see why. It makes sense. It's just kind of learning how to handle them appropriately. And it's also just kind of a cultural shift, right? So modern games are designed for modern players who want more story-based, narrative-driven events. And those stories are going to involve the player characters being the heroes, saving the day, and going on to like universe, spanning adventures. They're not about paying a torchbearer to carry your torch to delve into the dungeon. Most modern games aren't like that, but you can still apply these concepts to those style of games. It's very, very easy, and you can use it in any kind of game, whether it's 5e, like I said, or Shadow Dark or Daggerheart. Daggerheart has that whole concept of like anchors, like the relationships between characters. You can use that anchor concept with your henchmen, specifically like your second in command, that kind of thing, for narrative and story-based ideas. Obviously, they work very, very well in OSR games. Shadow Dark is a very good example of a blending of 5e with OSR, and I think they work perfectly in that type of game. But even in a standard 5e game, you just have to change your perceptions of what kind of game you're playing, and then you can incorporate henchmen and hirelings very, very easily. Okay, and it adds, benefits, or it adds tension, it adds stakes. It creates more role-playing opportunities, as we talked about, but it also makes it easy to implement some of those other rules that we talked about, like resource management and that kind of thing. So these are all reasons why you might want to incorporate these types of concepts, henchmen and hirelings, into your games. So that's really going to wrap up this very particular video here. And, just to recap, I want to just say that henchmen and hirelings, they were never optional flavor in the original game. They were a core survival mechanic and a campaign driver. And the game was built around that, and it's just changed over time, and it changes a lot of aspects of the game when you remove it. At least I think it does. But I want to hear your stories. How did you use them in a game? Did they desert at any time? Did they betray you? Did they save the day? Did you not use them? And why didn't you use them? All of that I would love for you to share in the comments below. And then while you're down there, you'll find links to all of my social media channels. You'll find links to my blog where I share new content from time to time. And you'll find links to all those different places where you can support the channel, the Patreon, the shop, all that kind of stuff is going to be in the show notes below. So the next time you're playing a game, let's say you're playing a 5e game, just stop for a second and think about, like, how would the game look different if you weren't just a band of heroes, but you were a company of adventurers with people that you're responsible for, and how would that change how you approach the game? So think about that. Share your notes in the comments below. Again, thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this video. So let's do the drink first. So this is kind of a riff on a Boulevardier, and it's actually like a riff of a riff. So first off, if you're not familiar, a Boulevardier is the shortest way to explain it is that it's a Negroni, but you swap whiskey for gin. So either rye or bourbon, your choice. Could be American whiskey too, I guess, or Tennessee whiskey, whatever you have on hand. I tend to use rye in mine. I also tend to up the portion of the whiskey a little bit. So traditionally a Negroni is equal parts. So 1 ounce each of gin, sweet vermouth, and Campari. For the Boulevardier, I tend to do somewhere between 1 1/4 ounce and 1.5 ounces of the whiskey, and then balance that with the Campari or the vermouth at 1 ounce each. Or sometimes I'll do 1 ounce of whiskey and then 3/4 each of vermouth and Campari. So that's kind of like what you're working with as a basis. So this drink actually that I made is sort of a riff on that, which was called an Embarcadero, created by a bartender named Claire Sprouse in the San Francisco area. And in her version of the Embarcadero, she uses rye whiskey as her spirit. And then for the components for the vermouth and the Campari, she uses 2 different things from a company called Lo-Fi. Company, distillery, I don't know what you want to call it, vintner, Lo-Fi, which is based in San Francisco, in California, Napa, as you see here specifically. So she uses Lo-Fi aperitif sweet vermouth. And it's kind of hard to see. You can get a little bit. So typically you think of a sweet vermouth as being sort of like a dark, like brick red color. And this is not. Now the bottle's green, so it's not really doing a lot of favors here to see, but you can kind of see through the glass here. It's very light. So this is an interesting version of a sweet vermouth because it's actually made with white wine. So all vermouth is made with wine. But this particular one is made with white wine, and it's white wine that's grown in the Napa region of California. So it's going to have a different flavor profile. Now, in her drink for the Campari portion, she uses Lo-Fi Amaro, which is very gentian forward, and it's also like kind of more golden in color. I didn't want to do that, partly because I didn't have any Lo-Fi Amaro, and so I decided to go back to the more traditional Campari. But I also did a split, so I didn't use all Campari. I did a split of Campari and Cynar. So I've talked about Cynar on the show before. It is an Italian Amaro that is based on it's artichoke. So, but you don't taste artichoke. I've mentioned this before. I kind of get more of like a chocolatey orange flavor out of it. It's like a lot of vodka is made out of potatoes, but you wouldn't say it tastes like potato, right? Don't be thrown off by the fact that it uses artichokes, because you're not making artichoke juice, folks. That's not what it's about. Okay, but one thing I just wanted to point out here, you'll notice it very specifically says refrigerate after opening. This is the vermouth. And a lot of people make that mistake. So, and a lot of people hate vermouth or think they hate vermouth. And it's probably because they went to a bar once and ordered like a martini, and it wasn't a good bar. And the bartender grabbed a bottle of vermouth off the top shelf that was full of dust and had been sitting up there since the 70s, not properly taken care of, and poured it into a drink. And I'll tell you, my dad actually did that once for a friend because he didn't know. He didn't know that the vermouth was supposed to be refrigerated after open and consumed within about 4 weeks. And so he poured his friend this drink, martini, and his friends could barely stomach it. And that was when my dad learned, because he said, like, it just didn't taste right. And I was like, Dad, how long have you had that vermouth? And he literally had it since like the 90s. And he made the drink probably like maybe 6-7 years ago for his friend. So that was a bad choice. So my dad learned his lesson before he passed on. And interestingly enough, I'm actually using one of his glasses here. I've used these before. I don't tend to like to use these on the show because you can see it's green and gold glass, and it does kind of hide the color of the drink, but I kind of thought the green sort of matched the green in the bottle here, so I thought that would be fun. I've got my orange here, my orange peel that I expressed the oils over the top. I'm just going to drop it in. And so cheers. I don't know what to call this because it's a riff on an Embarcadero, which is a riff on a Boulevardier. But there you go. It's quite nice. It's like a nice kind of transition into fall drink. I tend to drink more, I'd say like gin or Blanco tequila, clearer spirits when it's warmer out. That said, I will drink a martini at any time because I think they're delicious. Always with gin, of course. And then I tend to kind of start bringing in some more whiskey-based drinks when it gets into the cooler temps. Now, it's still pretty warm here in Southern California. We're in the 80s right now. Today is now September 13th. I've recorded the video over a couple days here, and I'm editing today. And I'm going to stick this at the end of the program here. But, so we are roughly a week away from the beginning of fall, the autumnal equinox, which is usually around the 21st of September, give or take a day or two on either end. And we are also about a week away from Negroni Week. So Negroni Week is it's like a charity fundraiser every year, and there are certain bars that participate. You can just go to negroniweek.com, look it up, and see if a local bar by you is participating. And I always get a shirt. Every year they sell shirts, and I buy a t-shirt. Those of you who follow me on either Twitter or Blue Sky know that I post myself wearing a geeky kind of t-shirt, and geek can be anything you're passionate about, and I'm passionate about Negronis and craft cocktails, so I feel that counts. But usually it's a comic book or Star Wars t-shirt or a D&D style t-shirt. But I post a different one every Monday, and I've been doing it for the past 168 weeks. So that's how many t-shirts I have, and I'm not ready to stop yet. So I have that many, unfortunately, to my wife's chagrin, I would say. Anyway, so Negroni Week's coming up, so it's a perfect time to start exploring Negroni families with, whether it's a standard Negroni with gin or whether it's a Boulevardier. And you can also make Negroni variation with tequila. It's called a Rosita. You can make them with rum. You can make them with mezcal. So, sample and try it out. Okay, so that's the drink. Now, the album, this is John Williams in Tokyo with the Saito Kinan Orchestra. Sorry, I don't pronounce Japanese very well, as you can tell. So Kinen, I believe it would be how it's pronounced. But in any event, this was a gift from my wife 2 years ago. This came out, or not 2 years ago, last birthday last year. So this came out about a year ago, 2024. It's a double LP, and it just features John Williams conducting, his famous songs, the Superman March, which I love. He's got a lot of Harry Potter themes on here, which, those are cool. Maybe you don't like the movies, or maybe you do, but the music is pretty good. The theme from Schindler's List. He's got music from Star Wars, old and new. So he's got stuff from The Last Jedi, which I'm sure a lot of people wouldn't like that. But the music's great, and I like that movie, so that's fun. But you've got classics, Princess Leia's theme, Throne Room finale, Yoda's theme. You've got the Raiders March from Indiana Jones, the Imperial March from The Empire Strikes Back. So really great stuff, double LP, and it's colored vinyl. So this one has, it's like, I guess, gold. It's goldish yellow. There's the sleeves. So yeah, I guess it's more gold than yellow. So it's really fun. And again, I've talked before, I like to listen to instrumental music when I am working on my notes and planning things out and everything like that, because it helps me more to focus when it has lyrics and singing vocals. I tend to get a little bit distracted, and I find that this makes it easier. So it's really fun. I normally listen to like instrumental jazz, but I love scores, movie scores. And so that's another thing that I play quite often. Okay, so that's a look at the bonus content. And let me know. See if I don't even know if this album is available. Like, I'm sure you could find it streaming somewhere, probably on YouTube or something. But let me know what you think. Let me know if you tried the drink or something like it. And I really appreciate you watching the video. Please, if you're still here, click on one of these other videos here and check them out. That really does help the channel. And cheers, and I'll talk to you next time.